what's going on in Canada on a macro scale, then you're probably aware of how over the past couple of years, average Canadians have felt poorer and poorer by most financial metrics, from increasing costs of goods and services, putting upwards pressure on monthly budgets, to skyrocketing interest payments on mortgage, in parallel to doubling rent prices in many metro areas across the country.
Beneath the glittering veneer of Canada's economic success lies a troubling reality, a nation on the precipice of a potential crisis. What dark forces are compounding to unravel the social fabric of this one-time prosperous land? As the once buoyant middle class finds itself increasingly squeezed, a palpable sense of unease has settled over the country, fueling fears that the Canadian fantasy may be slipping away. From the soaring costs of living to the stagnation of wages, this is the face of poverty in the 21st century, a slow, insidious erosion of financial stability that threatens to undermine the very foundations of Canadian society. The numbers are staggering, painting a bleak picture of a nation in crisis. According to a report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, nearly half of all Canadian households are just $200 away from insolvency each month. This means that a single unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, or a temporary job loss could be enough to push millions of families over the edge into financial oblivion. Data published by Statistics Canada show that the gap between rich and poor Canadians is growing the fastest on record. According to the report, the wealthiest 20% of Canadian households accounted for more than two-thirds of all net worth in the first quarter of 2023, while the poorest 40% accounted for less than 3%. The gap between the wealthiest and the poorest Canadians increased by 1.1% in the first quarter of 2023 relative to the same period last year. This was the fastest increase on record for these estimates, which date back to 2010, StatCan explained. The increase represents a gradual reversal of slightly reduced wealth inequality seen between 2020 and 2022. The gap between rich and poor decreased by 1.6% between the first quarter of 2020 and the same period in 2022. As the country stands at a crossroads, many interested Canadians worry if this is merely a temporary setback or the harbinger of a looming black swan event that could irrevocably transform the Great White North. In this video, we will discuss the multifaceted reasons behind Canada's declining economic prosperity. From the growing wealth gap to the challenges of affordable housing and healthcare, we'll uncover the systemic issues driving Canadians into financial insecurity. At its core, poverty is a lack of sufficient income to maintain a normal or comfortable standard of living. It's the constant stress of wondering how you'll make rent or put food on the table, the gnawing fear that one misstep could lead to a downward spiral of debt and despair. The United Nations defines poverty as more than the lack of income and productive resources to ensure sustainable livelihoods. Its manifestations include hunger and malnutrition, limited access to education and other basic services, social discrimination and exclusion, as well as the lack of participation in decision-making. For many Canadians, this is not some abstract concept or distant threat. It is a daily reality. According to government data, 3.2 million Canadians, or 8.7% of the population, lived below the poverty line in 2018. This includes over 500,000 children, many of whom go to bed hungry each night and lack access to the basic necessities of life. Considering Canada's wealth and resources, a disproportionate number of Canadians are living in poverty. In 2021, 7.3% of the Canadian population lived in poverty, a total of 2,717,615 persons. This included 621,235 persons in deep poverty, 1.7% of the population, and 2,096,390 living in shallow poverty at 5.7%. In addition, 6.9% of the Canadian population lived in households with incomes just above the poverty line, a total of 2,556,880 persons. Combined, 5,274,505 Canadians were living either in or at risk of poverty, accounting for 14.3% of the total population. But poverty is not just about income levels or statistical thresholds. It is a complex and multifaceted problem that touches every aspect of a person's life, from their physical and mental health to their education and job prospects. Those living in poverty often face a vicious cycle of deprivation and marginalization as the very conditions that keep them poor, such as lack of access to quality housing, healthcare, and education, also make it harder for them to escape poverty's grasp. So why are so many Canadians finding themselves on the brink of poverty, even in one of the wealthiest nations on Earth? The answer lies in a perfect storm of economic and social factors that have been brewing for decades. According to Statistics Canada, the average price of goods and services rose a cumulative 9.2% from 2015 to 2019, while they increased 14.8% between January 2021 and December 2022, while wages have only grown by 5.1% over the same period. This may not sound like a huge gap, but over time, it can add up to a significant erosion of purchasing power, particularly for low and middle income earners. Housing costs are a particularly acute pressure point for many Canadians. According to a 2022 report by the Canadian Real Estate Association, the average national home price hit an all-time high of $748,450 in March. As a result, many Canadians are spending a growing proportion of their income on shelter, leaving less money for other essential expenses. For renters, the situation is even more dire. A report by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation found that almost 1 in 5 Canadian households spent more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities in 2024. The rising cost of living has left many Canadians living paycheck to paycheck with little to no savings to fall back on in case of emergency. A 2021 survey by the Canadian Payroll Association found that 44% of Canadians say they would be in financial trouble if their paychecks were delayed by just 1 week. Disturbingly, 18% indicate they likely could not come up with $2,000 within a month for an emergency expense. Income inequality is another major driver of poverty in Canada. Despite the country's reputation for social mobility and a robust middle class, the gap between the rich and the poor has been widening in recent decades. According to a 2021 report by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the top 1% of Canadian earners held 25.6% of the country's total wealth, roughly $3 trillion, up from 13.7%. Meanwhile, the bottom 40% of earners held just 0.4% of total wealth. This growing concentration of wealth at the top has left many Canadians feeling left behind, struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living on stagnant wages. It has also put downward pressure on social mobility, making it harder for those born into poverty to climb the economic ladder. A 2017 study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, found that it would take 5 generations for a child born into a low-income family in Canada to reach the country's average income level, one of the worst rates among developed nations. Besides wealth inequality, the gap between low and high-income households also widened, as the share of disposable income between the bottom 40% and the highest 40% of earners reached 44.7%, a 0.2% increase over 2022. To further exacerbate the situation, the Bank of Canada increased the base interest rate by 0.25%, with the policy interest rate now standing at 4.75%. This, along with a string of other previous increases, has substantially raised the cost of borrowing, particularly for Canadians with variable rate mortgages. Since the central bank began a series of interest rate hikes at the beginning of last year, some of those with variable rate mortgages have seen their monthly payments increase by as much as $1,000 per month. In turn, this is prompting some landlords to increase rents as they seek to extract a profit from renters on top of their increased mortgage payments. In May, CTV News reported that average rent in all of Canada was up 9.6% over 2022, with the average asking price for a unit now surpassing $2,000 per month. The average is even higher in the country's most expensive cities like Vancouver and Toronto. High levels of household debt are another factor contributing to financial insecurity for many Canadians. According to Equifax Canada, non-mortgage debt rose by 4.1%, mainly fueled by a $15.9 billion rise in credit card debt during 2023 to $116.2 billion. The holiday period saw seasonal increases in credit card spending. However, when adjusted for inflation, the number suggests a slight drop compared to 12 months ago. This debt load leaves many Canadians vulnerable to economic shocks, such as job loss, illness, or rising interest rates. With the cost of essentials like food, housing, and utilities continuing to climb, families are being forced to rely on credit cards to make ends meet, trapping them in a vicious cycle of debt and financial insecurity. This financial precarity has left many Canadians with little choice but to turn to credit to cover basic expenses. A 2022 report by TransUnion found total Canadian active credit consumers at an all-time high of 31.2 million. Credit card delinquency rose by 15.8% during the third quarter of 2023, with consumers aged 36 to 55 seeing the largest rise at 20.8%. Credit card payment behavior can be a significant indicator of financial stress. The average balance of credit card holders rose rose to $4,119, up from $3,727 in the third quarter of 2022, exceeding the pre-pandemic averages. Moreover, the burden of debt is not evenly distributed across Canadian society. Low-income and marginalized communities, including Indigenous peoples, racialized Canadians, and single parents, are more likely to experience financial hardship and have fewer resources to fall back on in times of crisis. Job insecurity and precarious work are also major contributors to poverty in Canada. In recent years, there has been a significant shift away from traditional full-time employment towards part-time contract and gig work. According to a 2021 report by the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, 45% of Canadian workers could lose their jobs or see their hours significantly reduced due to automation over the next 10 to 20 years. This trend towards precarious work leaves many Canadians without the benefits, job security, and steady income they need to build a stable financial future. It also makes it harder for workers to qualify for employment insurance, or EI, or other social safety net programs, leaving them with little support if they lose their jobs. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated these trends, exposing the deep fault lines of inequality and the insecurity that run through Canadian society. While the government's emergency support programs such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit or the CERB provide a lifeline for many Canadians during the crisis, they also highlighted the precarious financial situation of millions of households. In 2020, 27% of Canadians reported that they would have trouble making ends meet if the CERB and other support programs were not available. The survey also found that 44% of Canadians were concerned about their ability to pay their bills and meet their financial obligations due to the pandemic. All of these factors culminate in proliferating financial insolvency across Canadian soil, and many Canadians find themselves teetering on the brink of financial devastation, with dreams of a comfortable life slipping through their fingers like grains of sand. As a result of policy choices and systemic failures that have left too many Canadians behind and ravenously scrambling for survival, the Canadian government is undoubtedly spurring an inevitable tide of poverty across the country. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.